Imagine surviving the end of the world, only to discover that the true hell began the next day. The ground stopped shaking. Death changed its method. November 1st, 1755, marked the definitive fall of Lisbon under nature's relentless fury. Pillars of faith crumbled. The tsunami swallowed desperate souls. Fire consumed the rest. The air turned into pure poison. A thick mist of pulverized limestone and ash covered the Portuguese capital for endless days. Breathing was self-flagellation. Pulmonary alveoli were tearing apart. Toxic smoke from the great fires slowly stifled the streets, destroying the biology of survivors. Coughing blood became a routine. The colossal All Saints Royal Hospital collapsed in flames, quickly turning into a giant open-air morgue. There was no safe refuge. Medicine disintegrated. Mutilated bodies piled up in squares, stained with soot, ashes, and pure human despair. The smell was unbearable. Charred flesh mixed with sewage. Surviving the initial collapse was just the macabre prologue to a relentless biological agony. Basic antiseptics were missing. A simple scratch killed. Gas gangrene devoured living human tissue in less than 48 hours. Entire limbs rotted away. Victims begged for water. The human body became an organic prison in extremely accelerated decomposition under the autumn sun. Groans echoed through the ruins. It was exactly in this scenario of absolute annihilation that authorities improvised new sanitary containment zones. Mercy did not exist. Extreme suffering was merely isolated and hidden far from the eyes of the Portuguese crown. Structures were born from the shadows. They were human flesh depots. One of these places was intended exclusively for the cruel and silent confinement of the totally undesirable sick. Madness and infection shared chains. But what awaited those dragged into the darkness of the São Bento ward would make the earthquake itself seem like an act of divine mercy. The São Bento Infirmary was not born as a beacon of hope for the wounded. Panic dictated the rules. It was forged by fear. Located on the fringes of a gutted Lisbon, the structure stood as a monument to sanitary despair. Damp stones absorbed agony. The geographical isolation was a calculated and cold choice by the state bureaucracy. They needed to hide the wreckage. The dead were not the royal authorities' greatest problem. It was the living rotting away. The infirmary functioned as a definitive black hole for medical cases considered completely untreatable. The mentally ill were dragged in. The contagious lost their humanity. There were no soft mats or bright wards to receive the bodies torn apart by the great tragedy. There were only makeshift dungeons. The limestone floor transformed into a frigid bed of continuous physical torture. The galleries suffered ruptures. The tremor destroyed foundations. The backflow of the primitive sewage system flooded the containment cells with toxic mud. Black water covered ankles. The smell burned eyes. Rats infested the flooded corridors in an incessant search for fresh and vulnerable human flesh. Biology collapsed quickly. The concept of medical treatment was reduced to isolating the biological threat until inevitable death. Screams echoed in the dark. The oppressive architecture of the place ensured that despair did not reach the main streets. Bars separated the worlds. The night cold penetrated bones. There was no adequate ventilation in the underground pavilions, clogged with the smell of impending death. The stale air suffocated. Miasmas mixed with the smoke. Every panting breath was a step much closer to the organic and unquestionable end. It was purgatory materialized. A warehouse of forgotten souls, where madness was the only possible escape from pain. The terror was constant. However, among the damp shadows of these flooded cells, the true dread did not come from the walls that imprisoned them, but from what they injected into their parched veins. Daily life in the ward was a funeral march without any kind of consoling music. Time dragged slowly. Survival depended on chance. Among the faces disfigured by pain and soot was young Joana de Deus. She was a simple seamstress. She was 23 years old. The earthquake crushed her entire family under the heavy rubble of downtown Lisbon. The shock shattered her mind. Wandering completely covered in ashes and someone else's blood, she was violently captured by the cleaning patrols. They classified her as a dangerous lunatic. Joana was thrown into the basements. Her delicate hands were cruelly bound by heavy, rusty and dirty iron rings. The metal cut her skin. Malnutrition destroyed muscles. She shared her flooded cell with terminal victims of typhoid fever and advanced gangrene. The water gnawed at wounds. The loneliness was overwhelming. The jailers wore rags soaked in vinegar to try to ward off the invisible miasmas of death. They rarely approached. When they did, it was to administer the fearsome and absurd medical treatments of the time. They believed in the balance of humors. For Joana and her companions in misfortune, this meant a sadistic torture disguised as science. Violent purges were forced. Caustic substances went down the throat. The theoretical goal was to expel the malignant disease from within the affected human organism. The result was tragic. A catastrophic dehydration began. Joana's body visibly withered with each new medical intervention in the dark basements. Her kidneys began to fail. Clean organic fluids were lacking. Her cracked lips bled profusely as she tried to pronounce the names of her dead loved ones. There was no drinking water. The thirst was excruciating. The daily ration consisted of hard bread and water contaminated by sewage seepage. Febrile delirium dominated. She embraced cold stones. Joana's suffering was but a grain of sand in a desert of continuous pain. Lives were discarded daily. But what exactly determined who agonized on the damp floor and who received a mere shred of dignity before death? Death should be the great and fair equalizer of all mortal men, but the hierarchy continued. Blue blood mattered. Even at the epicenter of the absolute sanitary collapse, corruption and privilege dictated survival. The administration was rotten. Bankrupt nobles bought comfort. Gold still whispered empty promises into the ears of guards and exhausted doctors. Resources guaranteed upper floors. They stayed far from the backflowing sewage and the collective madness consuming the dark basements. They received straw pillows. Fleas transmitted diseases silently. They had access to diluted wine and hot broths, prepared far from the contamination below. Power was cruel. Barber surgeons prioritized the rich. Tensions boiled silently under the constant dense smoke of air-purifying incense. Armed guards protected staircases. They separated purgatory from the false paradise. Rebellions of the mentally ill and the hungry were crushed with extreme physical violence and ruthlessness. Men coughed black blood. They were beaten to death. Morality had been completely buried along with Lisbon's ancient cathedrals. Nuns tried to intervene in vain. They were silenced by the military. The Portuguese crown demanded absolute and unquestionable order amidst the urban chaos. Bury the dead quickly. Hide the sick living. The black market for totally useless medicines flourished in the fetid corridors of the improvised ward. Guards traded pieces of bread. They hid coins in their torn clothes. Humanity disintegrated much faster than the rotting bodies in the underground dungeons. The organization of space was oppressive. It was a constant reminder that the poor were always destined to suffer infinitely more. The injustice was palpable. However, this fragile structure of control and privilege was about to crumble spectacularly. The virus does not choose. What would happen when biology itself decided to violently ignore the illusory barriers of gold and nobility? The absolute limit of the fragile human body was tested to its final rupture. The illusory containment gave way. Biology took its toll. The accumulation of decomposing corpses and the lack of sanitation created a microscopic time bomb. The infection spread rapidly. An epidemic of epidemic typhus swept through the St. Benedict Infirmary with uncontrollable fury. Thick doors did not matter. Gold coins lost their value. The stale air carried the silent death sentence to all floors of the complex. Nobles presented extremely high fevers. Terrifying delusions consumed brilliant minds. Their skin was quickly covered in dark spots and dozens of extremely painful pustules. The illusion of security collapsed. Panic replaced arrogance. The barber surgeons were the first to miserably succumb to the invisible and lethal disease. They coughed blood onto patients. Hungry leeches drank poisoned blood. Absolute and uncontrollable chaos took over the corridors, once organized by military force. Guards abandoned their posts. They fled to the ruins of the city in the vain hope of escaping the plague. The basements became tombs. Deadly silence reigned. Joanna and hundreds of other forgotten ones perished cruelly chained to the cold stones of the dungeon. They drowned in bodily fluids. The sewage backflow rose even further with the heavy November rains. Corpses floated in sludge. Putrefaction dominated the environment. The smell became so unbearable that birds fell dead while flying over the roofs of the complex. Multiple organ failure was killing. Kidneys dried by purges. Livers destroyed by toxins, lungs completely torn by the volcanic limestone dust that plagued the air of Lisbon. The fragility of the flesh was haunting. The infirmary turned into a massive and foul-smelling mass grave with no headstone, sealed by human cowardice. The silence was not of peace, but of total and unrestricted biological annihilation. Bodies rotted in the dark. No one survived to witness the unspeakable horrors of those final days of confinement and pain. But as the purifying flames finally consumed what remained of this gigantic human slaughterhouse, what would be the scar left on the soul of modern medicine? The soaked ashes of São Bento were eventually swept away by the icy winds of Pombaline reconstruction. The city was reborn from the shadows. Terror was cowardlily buried. Perfectly straight streets and symmetrical buildings forever hid the basements where humanity lost its soul. Official history lied. They preferred to exalt Lisbon's architectural resilience rather than remember the muffled screams on the flooded slabs. But the legacy survived. That cursed infirmary silently shaped the troubled future of European medical practice. The absolute sanitary collapse shocked. It proved that biological ignorance and prejudice were infinitely more lethal than any earthquake. The catastrophic failure of archaic methods of purging and bleeding amidst the chaos taught a lesson. It forced a painful scientific birth. The incalculable suffering of thousands of forgotten individuals served as an invisible foundation for the future. Modern concepts of public health were born. Asepsis and true quarantine became fundamental rules after the Great Disaster. Joana de Deus and the countless anonymous chained to the backflowing sewage never found any earthly justice. Their crushed bones rest eternally. They are forgotten under the illuminated and tourist-filled sidewalks of the beautiful and modern Portuguese capital. The stone purgatory disappeared. It ceased to exist on a physical and geographical plane, but its thick shadow remains deeply embedded. It is in the genetic memory of civilization. The absolute horror of November 1st, 1755, cruelly teaches us a great lesson. Civility is but a veneer. When the earth shakes with violence and power structures collapse, the truth appears. The true monster that emerges from the smoking ruins is our own institutional negligence. Nature destroys with indifference. But it is man who designs and builds the labyrinths of prolonged biological agony. To contemplate the darkness of São Bento is to look into the abyss of our fragility. Follow our dark work. Subscribe to this channel if you have the courage to face the infectious abysses of the past. For history is a relentless cycle, and the ruins of yesterday wait patiently to become the prisons of your tomorrow.